December 2012, Barrow in Furness. At 5:56 a.m., a 999 call pulled first responders to a quiet, rented home. Inside, paramedics fought to save a 13-month-old girl, Poppy Worthington, known to her family as the alarm clock, because she woke each day with playful taps on her cot and a cheerful mom that morning. There was only silence. What turned a child's bedroom into a crime scene? What happened to Poppy after that sudden, piercing cry in the middle of the night? Why did no one act when worrying signs appeared in her diaper? And how did the timeline of events keep shifting minutes at first, then nearly an hour? Each of these unanswered questions led investigators down a path filled with inconsistencies, and together, they reveal how overlooked warnings and broken procedures left a vulnerable child without protection. This is not a story told for shock. It is an inquiry into how warnings were missed, how crucial procedures broke down, and how a vulnerable child was left without the protection she needed. As we follow the evidence, hold one question in mind: why did so many simple safeguards fail in the very place a toddler should have been safest? If you ever see signs that don't feel right, an unexplained injury, a sudden change in behavior, or a cry that sounds different from the rest, don't dismiss them. Speaking up may be the one action that protects a child in time. Poppy's story is a reminder. Protection does not just come from systems, but from all of us choosing to notice, to question, and to act. Poppy Iris Worthington was born on October 12, 2011 in Cumbria, one of a pair of twins. Compared to her brother, she was healthier, quicker, and full of energy. From her earliest months, the family gave her an affectionate nickname, the alarm clock. At exactly 5:30 every morning, the familiar clinking of her bottle against the bars of the cot rang out, followed by her clear little voice, "Mom," the signal that a new day had begun. Poppy never went to sleep without her pink elephant pillow and her small bottle. She lay on her stomach, cheek pressed into the soft fabric, as if searching for safety. During the day, she chirped happily alongside her twin brother, adored and doted on by her 3 older half-sisters. To her family, Poppy was a little light, bringing joy to a cramped but warm home. And yet, that light slowly began to flicker. Relatives remembered Poppy was less chatty, sometimes unusually quiet. For a child once so lively, that was a signal adults should have stopped to question. But in the busyness of life, those changes were easy to dismiss. A child withdrawing into silence is rarely random. It may well be a cry for help that cannot be spoken. In the rented house belonging to her Aunt Tracy, Poppy's mother struggled to care for 6 children. A childhood marked by pain and the burdens of survival left her often exhausted. There were nights when she dozed off on the downstairs sofa, leaving the children asleep upstairs. Paul Worthington, 17 years her senior, drifted in and out. A relationship unstable, yet one she still placed her trust in. That trust would later prove to be a tragic mistake. Poppy still laughed, still played, still clutched her familiar pink elephant pillow, but behind that smile, the lively spark of her presence had already begun to fade into silence, a silence no one stopped to hear. In the summer of 2012, while changing a diaper, Poppy's mother froze when she noticed a tiny streak of red blood. For a baby only a few months old, it was the kind of sight that could terrify any parent. She brought her concern to a nurse, hoping for a clear answer, but the response was merely reassurance. It could be constipation, nothing to worry about, no tests, no follow-up. The mother felt partly reassured, but an opportunity to protect Poppy had slipped away. Experts often emphasize any unusual sign in an infant, however brief, deserves close attention. A child's body cannot explain itself. That responsibility belongs to the adults. Later that year, another event occurred that should have stopped everything. Poppy's leg was broken. There was no accident report, no questions asked. The fracture was never treated. For a toddler just learning to walk, this could never be considered normal. It was a warning sign that demanded adults dig to the root cause. But once again, it was ignored. By early December, as the family struggled with a wave of flu, Poppy began to change. The little girl who once sprang up after every nap now sank into deep exhaustion, to the point of needing to be woken. Then, on December 11th, seated in her familiar high chair, she suddenly screamed. a piercing cry clutching her tiny stomach. Her mother hurried to change her diaper, saw digestive signs, and breathed a sigh of relief when there was no blood. But that cry was unlike any fussing she had ever made before. It was a cry for help, only no one recognized it in time. Looking back, these were never isolated details: blood in the diaper, an unexplained fracture, disrupted sleep, a scream of pain. They were a chain of warnings, steadily accumulating, and when such warnings are ignored, the ending often comes too quickly, too suddenly. The night of December 11th, 2012 began like any other in the cramped house. After a day weighed down by flu symptoms, Poppy was dressed in pajamas, given her bottle and familiar pink elephant pillow, and placed in her cot at 7:30 p.m. That routine had become a ritual, a small circle of comfort that gave her a sense of safety. In the master bedroom, Paul Worthington followed his own routine, opening his laptop, checking football scores, then browsing adult content before shutting it down. A detail that might seem trivial at first glance, but later, when investigators pieced together the timeline, it became an important factor in shaping the broader picture. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Poppy's mother returned to the bedroom. Her twin brother was crying, congested and wheezing, which worried her. Exhausted from caring for 6 children, she took the boy downstairs, believing he would breathe easier in his stroller. Then she lay down on the living room sofa, thinking she would only rest for a moment. Upstairs, Poppy remained in her cot, and Paul was the only adult nearby. It was at that very moment that risk began to take form. A 14-month-old child who had already shown troubling signs in the previous week: heavy sleep, sudden stomach pain, piercing screams, was now separated from her familiar caregiver's arms. Child welfare experts often stress such isolation can turn a child from vulnerable into unprotected. Families with warning signs, blood in the diaper, an unexplained fracture should have been under stricter monitoring. But for Poppy, no one came to check. The system had heard the warnings, yet in the end, it left her alone, on the night that would prove fatal. After the mother carried Poppy's twin brother downstairs at 2 a.m., Poppy was left alone upstairs with Paul as the only adult nearby. Experts call this a high-risk point when a vulnerable child is left without familiar supervision. And, just a few hours later, the quiet of the house was torn apart. Between 5:30 and 5:45 a.m., the time when Poppy usually woke the household with the clinking of her bottle and her bright call of mom, a completely different sound rang out. It was a sharp, urgent scream, filled with pain. Paul claimed he woke up, but he gave conflicting times, sometimes 15 minutes earlier, sometimes nearly an hour later. That inconsistency would later undermine the credibility of his statement. According to Paul, he entered the room and found Poppy kneeling in her cot, her body stiff, teeth clenched, refusing the pacifier. It was an unusual sight, yet instead of following the family's routine, taking her downstairs to her mother, Paul made an unprecedented choice. He carried Poppy into his own bed. This break from routine became a pivotal knot in the story. Why? On that fateful night, did he suddenly act differently? Paul's subsequent statements raised even more questions. He said he checked Poppy's diaper, found it soiled but without blood, yet later medical examination revealed the exact opposite: bleeding had occurred for hours, along with injuries to sensitive areas and tears in her throat. Clinical language recorded it coldly, but behind it was a reality no child should ever endure. Paul claimed he went downstairs for only 90 seconds to get a fresh diaper. When he returned, Poppy was lying motionless, but what remained in the room told a different story. Her pink elephant pillow, the item she never slept without in her cot, was now on Paul's bed. A milk stain on the mattress suggested Poppy had lain there long enough for her bottle to spill. The pieces no longer aligned: abnormal behavior, contradictions between testimony and evidence. From a familiar routine, the story suddenly veered into a fractured narrative, a turning point that would haunt the entire investigation to come. The 999 call was logged at 5:56 a.m. The mother's voice was choked, trembling with despair. "My baby isn't breathing. Her lips are blue on the line." Sobs cut through every word. When paramedics arrived, they found Paul bent over his daughter's small body, pressing on her chest with force while repeating, "Come on, sweetheart, breathe." The mother stood beside him, clutching her head, crying uncontrollably, in a house once filled with children's voices. That morning was reduced to sobs and the urgent commands of rescuers. Despite the paramedics' desperate efforts, Poppy never regained consciousness. At Furness General Hospital, at 7:20 a.m., doctors declared her dead. Her mother collapsed into a chair, unable to speak. A medical worker later described the scene. "There are moments you never forget. That was one of them." But after the grief came disappointment. Police failed to secure the scene. Tracy Worthington, Paul's sister, came to the house to watch the other children. When she saw a dirty diaper in the middle of the living room, she grimaced at the stench and asked police, "What should I do with this?" The response, "Just throw it away." She carried it out to the outdoor bin, never knowing she had just discarded a crucial piece of evidence. It didn't stop there. Poppy's blankets, sheets, pillows, and pajamas were never collected. Paul's laptop and phone items that could reveal what he had been doing that night were not examined immediately. In a case of suspicious child death, ignoring the scene like this was akin to erasing the victim's voice. The autopsy conducted by forensic pathologist Dr. Allison Armour painted a picture starkly different from Paul's account. She discovered evidence of prolonged bleeding, bruising and tearing on the inner thighs, throat tissue damage consistent with an object being forced inside, and an untreated old leg fracture. When her findings were revealed, many medical staff who had been present that day were stunned into silence. A nurse shared, "I just kept asking myself, how did we not see it sooner?" The most damning result came from DNA traces of Poppy were found on Paul Worthington's genitals. When confronted, he said it might have been because he hadn't washed his hands after changing her diaper. Experts dismissed this outright, completely implausible, a hollow excuse faced with evidence that could not be denied. It took 8 months after Poppy's death for police to finally make arrests. In August 2013, both her father and mother were taken into custody for questioning. The local community was abuzz. Why had it taken so long within the family? That silence was a stretch of weary days. The mother, torn by grief and guilt, endlessly asked herself whether there was something she had missed. Paul, in stark contrast, remained tight-lipped, rarely showing emotion. Prosecutors ultimately focused on him as the prime suspect, and his silence during those months only clouded the picture further. Investigative reports identified at least 12 major failures in law enforcement procedure. The crime scene was not properly secured. Evidence went missing. Critical devices were not seized in time. Each lost detail slammed shut another door on the hope of justice for the community. Such negligence bred outrage if even the most basic evidence could not be preserved. How could a child ever be protected? In the family court hearings of 2014-2015, Judge Peter Jackson sat quietly through hundreds of hours of testimony. He was never harsh, yet each question he posed targeted a gap in the record. This court did not require proof beyond a reasonable doubt, as in criminal trials, only on the balance of probabilities. After reviewing the full medical files, legal data, and timelines, he concluded that Paul Worthington was responsible for inflicting serious harm on Poppy in the final hours of her life. In the courtroom, the mother buried her face in her hands, trembling at the verdict. Paul sat motionless, eyes downcast, betraying no expression. In 2017, the public inquest led by coroner David Roberts summoned dozens of witnesses. Medical professionals, social workers, and Poppy's parents all were forced to confront old memories. Some broke down in tears recalling that morning. Others admitted, "We missed the warning signs." Paul, once again, clung to silence. He refused to answer 252 times, offering only a few written statements through his sister. Legally, that was his right, but emotionally, it left a void in the public's mind when truth was most needed. He chose silence. The coroner's final conclusion confirmed that Poppy died in an unsafe environment, and that she had endured harm before her death. Yet because of the strict criminal standard of proof, the verdict could not declare it unlawful killing. The Crown Prosecution Service reviewed the case twice, in 2015 and 2018, but refused to prosecute, citing insufficient evidence for the family. This was a crushing blow. The truth was there, but the door to justice had closed because what should have been preserved had been lost from the start. When evidence is not safeguarded, justice cannot be carried out. That lesson belongs not only to investigators, but to the entire community. Every detail, however small, may be the key to protecting the truth and protecting a child. When the family court's ruling was made public in 2016, it sent shockwaves across the UK. For many parents, it was not just news, it was a nightmare awakening their deepest fear, that a child could be abandoned within the very systems designed to protect them. That grief spread into anger, and then into widespread conversations if Poppy could not be saved. Were their own children truly safe? On social media, the campaign for justice for Poppy spread quickly. Her photo with the radiant smile and bright eyes became a symbol, not just of one personal tragedy, but of an entire system's failure. People looked at that picture and asked how many warning signs were ignored before that smile disappeared. This was the moment when the story no longer belonged solely to the Worthington family. Sharing her story became a way to raise awareness. When we see unexplained injuries, sudden withdrawal, or troubling behavior within a household, speaking up can save a life. The hidden clues on Poppy's own body, untreated fractures, recurring trauma could have been noticed by many adults who had the chance to intervene. The case ignited vital conversations about mandatory reporting, professional training, and the shared responsibility we all carry to protect vulnerable children. Local communities in Barrow and Furness organized child safety workshops, determined that Poppy's death would fuel change rather than fade into statistics. When the family court's ruling was made public in 2016, it sent shockwaves across the UK. For many parents, it was not just news, it was a nightmare, awakening their deepest fear that a child could be abandoned within the very systems designed to protect them. That grief spread into anger, and then into widespread conversations if Poppy could not be saved. Were their own children truly safe? On social media, the campaign for justice for Poppy spread quickly. Her photo with the radiant smile and bright eyes became a symbol, not just of one personal tragedy, but of an entire system's failure. People looked at that picture and asked how many warning signs were ignored before that smile disappeared.
Even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can surprise us with its resilience. The 16-year-old girl at the center of this case demonstrated courage that many adults couldn't muster. Her decision to speak up at the Youth Challenge Academy didn't just save herself, it saved her 6 siblings from continued abuse.
In Barrow and Furness, where Poppy grew up, the community began hosting child safety workshops, training people to recognize and report risks. These gatherings did more than provide knowledge, they turned grief into action. Amid loss, a new resolve took root that Poppy's death would not be reduced to a cold statistic, but would serve as a driving force for real change. Paul Worthington fled the UK in 2016 after receiving death threats. As of 2025, his whereabouts remain unknown. The other children were immediately removed from parental care after Poppy's death, placed under protective guardianship while investigations continued. The mother, still insisting on the need for justice for my daughter, lives with the weight of missed signs and misplaced trust. The Police Complaints Commission confirmed multiple investigative failures, but assigned no accountability. The case files thick with what should have been preserved evidence and testimony instead record a chain of professional failures that allowed the perpetrator to escape justice. Policy changes emerged slowly. Training procedures for investigating sudden child deaths were updated. Guidelines for interagency communication when multiple warning signs of child risk appear were strengthened. Yet advocates argue these incremental reforms fail to address the deeper structural issues that allowed Poppy's death to happen. The medical community implemented new protocols for documenting unexplained child injuries, creating a paper trail that cannot vanish like physical evidence. Social workers received additional training in recognizing clusters of concerning incidents rather than treating each one in isolation. Educational programs now teach parents, teachers, and community members how to recognize behavioral changes in children withdrawal, abnormal sleep patterns, sudden fearful reactions as possible indicators of trauma. These programs emphasize that over-reporting is always better than under-reporting when a child's safety is at stake. Today, Poppy Worthington should have been 14 years old. Instead of celebrating birthdays and school milestones, her legacy lives on in the lessons her case forces us to confront. She will forever remain 13 months old, a bright light extinguished too soon by failures at every level of the system meant to protect her. Her case joins the tragic roster of preventable child deaths, each exposing the same patterns: warning signs missed, investigations mishandled, and a lack of accountability. Yet each case also strengthens the resolve of those fighting for reform. Child welfare advocates invoke Poppy's name when pushing for mandatory reporting laws, enhanced investigative protocols, and broader community education programs. Her beloved pink elephant pillow, mentioned repeatedly in court records as her constant companion, has become a symbol of lost innocence, but also of the comfort and safety every child deserves. When we verify caregivers, require background checks, and trust our instincts about troubling situations, we honor her memory by protecting the futures of other children. The story of Poppy Worthington is not only about the tragic death of a child, it is about our collective responsibility to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Every missed warning sign, every dismissed concern, every failed investigation represents a choice to look away rather than pay attention.
The defense strategy appeared to focus on challenging the credibility of witnesses and the admissibility of evidence. They argued that poverty and alternative lifestyle choices were being criminalized. This defense, while legally necessary, rang hollow against the photographic evidence of children living in underground bunkers.
We cannot bring Poppy back, but we can ensure her story becomes a catalyst for change rather than another forgotten tragedy. Be a voice for children, report concerns today. Share her story not for shock, but for education, because somewhere, right now, another child needs the protection Poppy never received. The question is not whether we have the power to stop such tragedies. We do. The question is whether we have the courage to act when we see the warning signs. For Poppy, and for every vulnerable child, that courage must become our commitment. Break the silence of neglect. Be the guiding light that leads a child to safety.